Indiana football took part in Big Ten Media Day to kick off the season on Tuesday, and excitement was the word of the day for the Hoosiers.
You are Locked On Hoosiers, your daily podcast on the Indiana Hoosiers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, guys? It is Wednesday, July 27th. This is a Locked On Hoosiers, your one and only daily one-stop shop for everything IU athletics. I'm your host, as always, Jacob Rude. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Hoosiers your first listen every single day. Big Ten Media Day began on Tuesday, will carry over into today, but Tuesday is when the Hoosiers took part in it. And as I said, excitement, kind of a renewed energy were some of the key themes for Indiana on the day. We're going to talk a lot about what Tom Allen had to say because it was a very honest, very open version of Tom Allen. Also look at some of the comments from the players as well. Not going to talk a ton about Kevin Warren. We're going to save that for Friday's episode. Just a lot to talk about with Tom Allen and the Hoosiers. He opened up the day. He was one of each coach had about 15 minutes at the big kind of presser podium where everybody could ask questions and whatnot. So he opened the day there and had some interesting notes. He didn't go into a ton of detail there, just with the amount of people that are asking questions. It's a lot of national media as well, but there were some interesting takeaways from that. He said, basically, there's not going to be a dual quarterback system this year. That's something IU fans have unfortunately seen in the past. He simply said, whoever wins the QB battle is going to be the starter. There will be no dual quarterbacks. Didn't offer a ton of insight into the quarterback battle. If I'm being honest, he wasn't asked a lot about it. In terms of the battle itself, it's between Jack Tuttle, it's between Connor Bazelak. But that's really all we know right now. It's going to be those two. He said that they didn't feel strongly enough after spring practice that one of them had separated themselves, so they're going to go into fall camp with an open battle. So we'll have that to look forward to here starting next week when practice begins. Donaven McCulley will have some packages at quarterback. A little bit of a surprise, but Tom Allen reiterated that McCulley came to him to make the switch to wide receiver, but that he is still going to have some special packages at quarterback this season. So just because he's made the switch doesn't sound like it. Sounds like we could still potentially see him at quarterback in special situations and special plays and whatnot this upcoming season. He was asked about McCulley's switch to wide receiver and kind of who is taking him under their wing. IU doesn't have really the veteran receiver there to do that. What they do have is wide receiver coach Adam Henry, who came in this season from the NFL and says he's been really key in helping him adapt to the new position and really highlighted Henry as the guy that has helped McCulley along. Talked about the linebacker position and filling the hole left by Micah McFadden. He mentioned each of the transfers, but interestingly mentioned Deshaun McCullough as someone that they kind of expect to have an impact this season. We've talked about him a fair amount. A true freshman coming in, playing at linebacker is not common, but McCullough is a very talented person. IU has a very big hole to fill. Kind of pair those together, and it sounds like McCullough is going to have some opportunities to get onto the field. Hoosiers were also picked last in the Big Ten East in the preseason poll. Tom Allen said they're going to use that as motivation, and as you would expect, he talked a little bit later on in the day at his little podium. He was asked if he kind of feels more comfortable with a team that has low expectations, and while he didn't say that, he says it's a more maybe familiar role that they've had. It's easier to get guys motivated when you're the underdog. So they're going to use that being picked last in the Big Ten East as that motivation, as being an underdog. As I said later on in the day, there were about a dozen individual podiums and with press conferences going on at the same time that weren't televised. Tom Allen had his session very open, very honest, very interesting. It lasted about an hour, fielded a lot of questions. He was asked about the decision to become the defensive play caller once again. He said it honestly just felt weird, didn't feel right, not calling plays defensively, especially as things went south on that end last season. He acknowledged that the buck stops with him, and defense is his expertise. So he wanted to take back control and get things right again, and get things fixed on that side of the ball. He talked about the equitable was a word he used a couple times, in what he wanted Big Ten scheduling to be, and acknowledged that Big Ten East isn't quite that. He didn't outright say it, but he danced around it. I'll say what he didn't want to say. He wants an equitable schedule, said he expects there to be the removal of divisions in the future. It didn't happen this season. They can go away at any point now. It's a Big Ten decision now at this point. The NCAA has made their ruling, so we'll see what the NCAA decides, because any move they make next season is going to be short-term, because UCLA and USC are going to be joining the year after that. He was asked, there was some discussion about last season, a fair amount, because things went really wrong last season. He was asked if there was a point where he kind of realized how badly things were going. He said there wasn't necessarily, but he pinpointed that Iowa game that they opened the season with as a really tough loss, and simply the way it happened. He said it was deflating, that you have a pick six, you have a long touchdown run, you get smacked right away. You come in with all these expectations and you just get absolutely thumped in the first game. He said it was deflating, and it was a really tough loss for the program. The injuries started mounting after that. Everything just kind of snowballed after that. And but he noted that Iowa game, in the manner it happened, was really just tough. It was a tough loss, and it kind of snowballed from there. He only talked a little bit about USC and UCLA, said he was caught off guard by the announcement. It was not something he certainly expected. And excitement was what he expressed, and that's what all the coaches talked about. They were excited for adding UCLA and USC to the conference. Tom Allen talked about an aspect that I hadn't really considered, in that it allows them to recruit kids in California now. And he said they've already reached out to kids and started talking to kids out west that they wouldn't normally recruit, and that has opened up kind of a new pipeline of sorts to recruit some of those kids as well. So otherwise they wouldn't really even look at those kids and spend time recruiting them. But now that's kind of Big Ten country, he said he's open and starting to recruit some of those kids a little bit. So an interesting wrinkle in there. He was also asked about the fact that IU is opening the season with Illinois, and it's 4 times in the last 6 years they've opened with a Big Ten foe, and how other programs are not opening the season with conference games as frequently as IU is. It was one of the funnier moments, because he acknowledged that it certainly is not a random draw that is leading IU to play these games. He said he understands some of the reasoning behind it, and he was asked if he's talked to the Big Ten at all about it. And he kind of paused and said, no, but maybe I should. It's something that IU has had to do more than anyone else in this kind of new scheduling. And there's been the games against Ohio State, the game against, the COVID season, everybody opened with a conference game, but it still count, the Penn State game, Iowa last year, Illinois this year. So it's something IU is doing that not every other school is doing. It's odd. I don't really understand it. I didn't really realize how often IU is doing it versus other teams. We'll see if it continues as they kind of change divisions, add schools, change around the scheduling. But I'm not personally a huge fan of it, Tom Allen didn't seem to mind it. He kind of also acknowledged it's not under his control, so he kind of has to look at the positive at it rather than the negative and complaining about it. Now, one thing, or I guess a couple big things he talked about was a meeting at the end of last season that we talked about, and something that the players did to start this season that has him really excited. We're going to dive into both those topics here in a moment. But betonline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including MLB, NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, they have you covered. They also have NCAA football future odds for team wins. If you're feeling froggy and excited after Big Ten Media Day, I use over-under as 4 wins. So if you think that they're going to contend for a bowl game next season, throw some money down on that one. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Hoosiers your first listen every single day. Make sure you're subscribed over on YouTube, where we premiere the episodes there daily. Make sure you follow us on Twitter as well. I tweeted all the quotes from Twitter from Big Ten Media Day. So make sure you're following us at LO_Hoosiers on Twitter. Now, Tom Allen dedicated a pretty large amount of his time talking about a couple notable moments. We mentioned he talked about the Iowa game. Look, he talked quite a bit about last season and trying to kind of pinpoint where things went wrong. And of that note, we mentioned before back in the spring about a meeting that happened right after the Purdue game last year and the significance of it. A lot of the team leaders came in right after that Purdue game, had a meeting talking about how to avoid having a season like that happen again. Tom Allen gave a lot more details on what that meeting was. He said there were a number of people that texted him right after the Purdue game. They reached out to him. Cam Jones, Tiawan Mullen, Jack Tuttle, even Micah McFadden. I believe Jalen Williams was another one he mentioned. He mentioned a number of people. He said there were a number of guys that came that didn't even text him. But they said they texted him after the Purdue game wanting to meet the next morning. And there were some they had NFL scouts basically in Bloomington to meet with families so that they could explain the process of what is going to be happening with the kind of the NFL draft. So while they were juggling that, meant that the meeting had to be really early in the morning, but everybody showed up, and he said it was about an hour-long meeting where he wanted them to be very honest about what happened and who did it. He obviously didn't reveal any of the names, the whodunit part of it, but he wanted names, he wanted examples of guys that the players didn't think were committed to the team last season, or players who had moments that stuck out to him. And he said that there were small moments that players pointed out, just really small, minuscule moments that, looking back in hindsight, looked a lot worse given how the season played out or how that player performed last season. So he said it was a very open and honest meeting, and one that was really positive and reassuring in a number of ways to have those guys come in. He said, kind of in this modern era of transfers and things of that nature, that the day after the season ends, they're going out and recruiting guys. They're talking to players, trying to keep them from transferring. So to get these guys coming in, talking to them about next season right away was not something he certainly expected, but something that he was very positive and welcoming and optimistic about. So it was certainly interesting to hear some of the details of that meeting and the impact it had kind of moving forward. And to that note, he also mentioned that both Cam Jones and Jack Tuttle came to him together. They had put together a PowerPoint that they wanted to show the team about just avoiding what had happened the year before. It wasn't something that Coach Allen had told them to put together. It wasn't something that was assigned to them in any way. They just came to him, said they wanted to do it. He sat down with them and helped them edit the PowerPoint to maybe add a couple things, remove a couple things, change a couple things, but said it was their desire. And when they met with the team, that he wasn't a part of it. He didn't want to be a part of it. He wanted it to be led by them. And that was something he talked about. He said one of the keys to being a successful team is that it is a player-led team. And to have that happen, that kind of leadership happen organically the way it did, was one of the reasons he's really optimistic about what this team can do moving forward. Tom Allen is naturally an optimistic, energetic person, but just the energy and the optimism he was showing after a 2-win season was telling. It was interesting. He believes really strongly in this team and is really excited about what they can do. He said there's a different vibe around this team that wasn't really there last year. And again, not necessarily pointing fingers, but there's just a different feel to this team. Hopefully it means that last year was a flash in the pan and they'll be able to get back on track this season. But very open, very honest from Tom Allen throughout the day, but particularly when talking about last season and the offseason kind of moving forward into this one. So really interesting stuff from him on the day. Players spoke as well. Tiawan Mullen, Cam Jones, AJ Barner. We'll look at some of their comments on the day and some stuff that stuck out from them as well here in just a moment. So the player interviews went on simultaneously. So I cannot be in 3 places at once. I stayed with Tiawan Mullen and watched his interview. It was a very interesting one. I got quotes for Cam Jones and AJ Barner from Twitter as well. But when it came to Tiawan Mullen, he was asked about why he came back. There were a number of reasons. He mentioned having his brother there, and we'll talk about that in a minute, having his brother come to the program. He wanted to get his degree, but most importantly said he couldn't leave on the note of a 2-10 season. And that was something that he talked about, the kind of narratives that came with the 2-win season and how his wording was something along the lines of people must have forgot what we did in 2019 and 2020. So he seemed very motivated to prove people wrong after what happened last season. To that note, he said he was feeling great physically, spiritually, and mentally. He was ready to go. He was waiting for that question. He laughed when it was asked. He said he couldn't wait to answer that question because he feels great, which is huge news for Indiana, to say the least. Talked about his younger brother being in the program. Was asked a couple different times about it. He said it's made him go harder because he knows his brother is watching him even when he doesn't realize it. His brother is paying attention to him. And so it's made him go harder. It's made him stay on his toes. But he absolutely loved, he said he's loved having his brother around with the program. Said he's had to play good cop and bad cop at times. If the coaching staff gets on him, he has to play the good cop. If the coaching staff is being nice to him, he has to play the bad cop. But he has been there to help lead him, help teach him. And you could see his face light up every time he got to talk about his little brother as well. So that's certainly been a highlight for him so far this season. But Tiawan just had a confidence to him that was noticeable, kind of similar to Tom Allen. He talked about the importance of getting back to Indiana's identity, swarming the ball, making plays on the ball. If the ball's in the air, get to the ball. If the ball's on the ground, get to the ball, things of that nature. So those were things that were missing. I use a defense that's really excelled at takeaways when they're at their best under Tom Allen, and that wasn't there last season. So that's something that Mullen said Coach Allen's talked about, is just getting the team back to their identity, which probably is also a reason why Tom Allen wanted to take over the defensive play calling as well last season. Cam Jones, kind of to that note, said the defense has an edge and a swagger that was missing from last season, which I don't necessarily disagree with. I thought the defense, I've said this many times, was put in no-win positions quite often, but I thought there were moments when they played really well, especially early in the season after that Iowa game, which, I mean, they were always going to look good against Idaho. I thought they played well in the first half against Cincinnati, but to his point, there weren't a lot of moments later in the season where there was that edge and that swagger. So he said that he's tested guys through the spring, really hitting guys hard during spring practice. Said everybody kept getting back up, and that's a sign to him of a really strong, really good team. Funny quote from him. He said, quote, "If Tom Allen told me to go run through a brick wall right now, I'll just do it, no questions asked, because that's how much I believe in everything he has to say." That belief has been there amongst his players, but just your latest reminder of how much these guys look up to Tom Allen and the impact he has on them. AJ Barner, one really interesting note. He said there's more options in Walt Bell's offense than there were last season. Barner says he often can change his path mid-route depending on the coverage, which I think is encouraging, especially if you can get receivers and quarterback on the same page. If everybody's reading things right, it means that it should lead to more openings, having kind of a more flexible offense to that point. It requires there to be a lot of chemistry that there's a little bit of worry it might not be there with a new quarterback and a whole host of new wide receivers and things of that nature. All the guys were asked about players that stood out, breakout potential players. They all gave a lot of different answers. Sean Shivers was a name that was mentioned many times over. I think each of the players mentioned him, which is really encouraging, really interesting. Tiawan specifically was asked for one player that stood out for him and proceeded to name about a dozen. So there were a lot of players he mentioned that have stuck out to him. Most of them were defensive backs. Jalen Williams himself, Cam Jones, mentioned a couple defensive linemen, said the whole offensive line. Sean Shivers he mentioned. So there's a lot of guys he talked about, some young players as well. Tom Allen was asked about punt returning now that David Ellis is, well, not punt and kick returning, now that David Ellis is not going to be around. That was a role he had. He mentioned a whole host of people, DJ Matthews among them, mentioned a couple different true freshmen. Omar Cooper was one of them, the wide receiver out of Indianapolis, as guys that could come in and do it. He noted, obviously kick returning is a lot different than punt returning, but he mentioned a whole host of people that could come in and potentially do that. Bryant Fitzgerald, the defensive back, was another one among them. James Mons was another one. So a lot of guys that could come in and be that explosive playmaker. Obviously, DJ Matthews had a punt return for touchdown last year, had a couple big returns before his injury, but that was also where he got injured. So we'll see if that is something he's open to doing next season, assuming he is healthy. Really exciting day. Has me really excited for college football once again. I've been in a college basketball mode, but being a part of Big Ten Media Day, hearing all of the IU coaches, players speak, has me really excited for college football again, which is good because it is coming up on us now. As I mentioned, first I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Hoosiers your first listen every day. We're going to be back with you on Friday I want to talk kind of more in depth about what Kevin Warren had to say during his opening presser, because there's a lot of interesting comments he made, obviously about the expansion within the conference, what the future might hold, things of that nature. So we're going to dive into all that in Friday's episode. Know what your team is up against across the Big Ten with Locked On Big Ten. Every day, host Nate Dickinson and the local experts of Locked On take you across the Big Ten in 30 minutes. Make Locked On Big Ten your second listen. Locked On Big Ten. I'll be on there tomorrow. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about Big Ten Media Day. Follow us on Twitter if you haven't already at LO_Hoosiers. Subscribe to the podcast. Leave a quick rating and review. All that helps us out a ton if you can do so. Most importantly, though, guys, have a terrific Wednesday in LEO.